and it didn't go in because he was already filled with a life of devotion to the Supreme. And so in chapter 5, the father, his name is Hiranyakasipu. Hiranyakasipu sat his dear little son on his lap, and oh, my dear son, oh, sweet boy, please tell me the best thing that you've learned from your teachers. Now, what he learned from his teachers, not from Sandanamarka, but there's some detail, I guess we have to go back. While he was still within the womb of his mother, he heard spiritual teachings from a perfected person named Narada Muni. And spiritual messages affect the soul even when all their faculties aren't well developed. Spiritual sound vibration impacts the soul, regardless of the stage of development of their bodily form. So, Prahlada Maharaj heard from this great sage Narada Muni, and that's the best thing he learned. So when his father asked him, what's the best thing you learned? He repeated what the best thing he learned from Narada Muni, not from these other two teachers. So we're going to say the verse together, especially those of you that have handheld devices. You can read it right on your phone. Tat sadhu manye suravarya dehinam Dada samudvigna diyam asatrahat idvatma patam griham andakopam vanam gato yadharim ashayeta. So we discussed this several times. This is the fourth time we've seen the verse. This is just review, because you hear again and somehow may go in a little deeper. And you can hear it again by listening to Prabhupada's recorded lectures. You'll hear it dozens of times. And that's one good way for it to go in. So the Asura Varya, those are in the groups of Asuras, they are Sada Samudvigna Diyam. They're always full of anxieties. Samudvigna Diyam. Their intelligence, Diyam, is filled with anxieties. Why? Asatrahat. They are thinking in terms of the material conception of life, I and mine, and all that goes with it, and therefore filled with anxieties. And so his advice to his father, the best thing he learned is the Atma Patam, the place where spiritual culture is stopped. Hidvatma Patam Griham, it's like an Anda Gupam, a blind well. And we don't have that situation here in the West, blind wells. But in India, there's such things. And our friend took a little walk. That's okay. What's a blind well? Any of our younger generation people want to volunteer? Hello? What's a blind well? Do you know what it is? Would you like to know? Good. A well is a place where you get water, right? You dig down, way down there is some water. And when the water dries up, then people stop using the well. So when they stop using the well, some grass may grow over the top of the well, but there's still the shaft that goes down, and it's a blind well. And sometimes people unknowingly see grass and think it's ground, and they step on the grass and it's not ground, it's a blind well, and they fall down the blind well and crash. So material life, the place where there's no spiritual culture, is compared to a blind well. There's no water, and it's very dangerous. So such a person who is in this upper category, they're thinking in terms of the body, dehinam. They're in the group of asuras who are thinking in terms of the body and I and mind, and their intelligence is filled with anxieties. they should give it up because it's a place like a blind well. And vanam gato. Vanam means forest, and gata means to go. And then Hari Ashrayeta, take shelter of Hari. Hari Ashrayeta. So here's the translation. Whoops, no translation. We did the translation. That was one teaching. That was the first time he was sitting on his father's lap. He didn't like it. He told Chandranamarka, this boy's been polluted by the enemy. So protect him and make sure he doesn't get further polluted. So the two teachers, Chandranamarka, try to brainwash this little boy, and it's not going in, it's not going in, it's not going in. And they say, what happened to you? You've been polluted like the enemy is. So that if it's friends and enemy. And I didn't have the Sanskrit here, but here's what Prahlad says. The second teaching. When the Supreme Personality of Godhead is pleased with the living entity because of his devotional service, one becomes a pandita and does not make distinctions between enemies, friends, and himself. Intelligently, he then thinks, every one of us is an eternal servant of God, and therefore we are not different from one another. That's, of course, on the spiritual platform. On the material platform, there's lots of differences. As they say, good, bad, and ugly. So there's lots of differences. So the idea here is the behavior is one thing, the soul is another thing. The oneness is on the platform of the soul, and then the variegatedness is on the platform of the body. Of course, on the spiritual platform, there's also variegatedness, but mostly people struggle with bodily identification on the material plane, and such persons aren't panditas. Vidyavanaya sampane brahmani gavihastini shuni chaiva supake cha pandita samadarshana. Pandita samadarshana. So he's just expressing what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita about a pandit who sees equally. And the application of this is, although Shanda and Amarka are treating him very harshly, he doesn't see them as enemies nor friends, but they see him as the voice of the enemy. So the one who has spiritual vision sees everyone, at least in principle, as a servant of God. Now, just hearing a recording today where one of my godbrothers, Yogeshwara Prabhu, was discussing this topic. And some of you may know Yogeshwara Prabhu. He's a very eloquent speaker. And one of the things that he did as far as his income for his family life, and because it was some interest to him, he, for something like 5 years, interviewed people who were involved, survivors of the Holocaust. And he wrote books on it and gave public speeches on it. And so during this talk that I was hearing the recording of, he's saying, it's really hard, to look at the people who were the perpetrators of the Holocaust and be forgiving and see them pandita samadarshana, feel compassion for the perpetrators. It's a challenge. So being a pandita is not ordinary, but it's certainly possible. And he went on to describe how it's possible. But so the requirement that's being mentioned is that the personality of Godhead being pleased with the living entity because of his devotional service. What happens? The knowledge that's within becomes awakened. The covering that's covering that knowledge within becomes removed. And then one can see things with a spiritual perspective, pandita samadarshana. So Prahlada is on that platform, and the big picture is Prahlada is teaching the way of pure devotional service. Should look over this way too. Prahlada is teaching the way of pure devotional service. Prahlada is teaching the way of pure devotional service. And pure devotional service means many things. But one of the things it means is our original consciousness becomes awakened. For original consciousness to be awakened, the coverings, it's like sprouting a seed. It's a nice example because it's quite the same. A seed has life inside, but inside the covering of the seed, it can stay for hundreds of years. It just stays life packed up inside that seed. And then there's a way to sprout the seed. And when the seed starts to sprout, two things. The life starts to come out, and the covering starts to fall away, becomes softened, and eventually falls away. And same thing. The consciousness of pure devotion is dormant within, but it has to be awakened. The sadhu sangha is the awakening method, and what sadhus do to help awaken is sound vibration. It's just like what we're doing. This spiritual sound, taking the vibration of Prahlada Maharaj and repeating